China has now entered the Caribbean crisis, and this changes everything. Beijing has issued sharp warnings to Washington over what it calls the abuse of long-arm jurisdiction, the extraterritorial enforcement of American sanctions. Chinese officials are defending Venezuela's right to trade, and here's the critical detail that transforms this entire story. The tankers being seized by the United States were carrying Venezuelan oil bound for China. This is no longer just about Venezuela. This is about whether the United States can prevent China from accessing energy resources in what Washington still considers its sphere of influence. This is about the Monroe Doctrine in the 21st century. And this is about whether American power can actually enforce the rules Washington claims to uphold. Let me explain what's really happening here, because the Venezuela crisis is increasingly looking like a pretext for something much bigger. First, let's understand China's stake in this crisis. China is Venezuela's largest customer for oil. Despite American sanctions, Chinese companies have continued to purchase Venezuelan crude, providing Caracas with a crucial economic lifeline. Chinese firms have invested billions in Venezuelan oil fields. This is not charity, this is strategic interest for China. Venezuelan oil serves multiple purposes. It diversifies China's energy supplies beyond the Middle East. It provides leverage in relations with the United States, and it demonstrates that Beijing can protect its economic partners from American pressure. So when the United States starts seizing tankers carrying Venezuelan oil to China, Beijing has a direct material interest at stake. This isn't abstract principle. This is about energy security for the world's second largest economy and largest energy importer. Now, let me tell you about a specific incident that reveals something very important about American power and its limits. There's a tanker called the Bella One. It's on the U.S. Treasury sanctions list. The Coast Guard has been pursuing it, and according to Reuters sources, the vessel has refused to allow boarding. Here's what's significant. The Coast Guard is waiting for reinforcements. They need specialized maritime security response teams, elite units trained to rappel from helicopters onto moving decks and take control in dangerous conditions. But these teams are limited, and according to sources, they're not currently nearby. Think about what this means. The Trump administration has announced what it calls an unprecedented pressure campaign against Venezuela. Officials describe it as a blockade, a quarantine of sanctioned vessels. But when confronted with a single defiant tanker, the agency tasked with enforcement doesn't have the immediate resources to board it. This is the gap between rhetorical commitment and operational capacity. The United States can announce blockades, but can it actually enforce them when challenged? Let me be clear about what the Bella One standoff reveals. The United States Coast Guard is stretched thin. There are large military forces in the region, significant troop levels, major naval assets, but those forces cannot substitute for Coast Guard boarding teams. Military personnel are not trained for law enforcement operations at sea. This matters enormously. If the United States cannot quickly enforce its declared blockade, if a single tanker can resist for days waiting for specialized teams to arrive, what message does that send? It sends the message that American threats may exceed American capabilities. It encourages others to resist. It suggests that the gap between what Washington announces and what Washington can execute is larger than many assumed. From a strategic perspective, this is a serious problem. Credibility in international politics depends on the ability to follow through on commitments. If adversaries believe that American bark is worse than its bite, they will test American resolve more frequently. China has introduced a specific term to frame its criticism: long-arm jurisdiction. This refers to the American practice of applying U.S. laws extraterritorially beyond American borders to companies and vessels from other countries operating in international waters. Let me explain why this is such a contentious issue. The United States imposes sanctions on Venezuela. Washington then declares that any company anywhere in the world that trades with Venezuela in violation of American sanctions is subject to penalties. This includes seizure of vessels, even if those vessels are flying foreign flags, carrying cargo owned by foreign companies in international waters. From Beijing's perspective, this is an abuse of power. China argues that the United States is claiming authority to enforce its laws globally. to dictate which countries can trade with which other countries to unilaterally impose rules on international commerce. China's position is straightforward. Venezuela is a sovereign country. It has the right to sell its oil to willing buyers. Other sovereign countries have the right to purchase that oil. The United States does not have the authority to prevent this trade. Now, the United States obviously disagrees. Washington argues that sanctions are a legitimate tool of foreign policy, that enforcing them is essential to American interests, and that countries must choose between trading with Venezuela and maintaining access to American markets and financial systems. But here's the deeper issue. This is really a debate about whether we live in a unipolar world where American preferences become global rules, or a multipolar world where multiple great powers have competing spheres of influence and competing visions of legitimate behavior. The script explicitly mentions the Monroe Doctrine, and this is crucial to understanding American strategy. The Monroe Doctrine, first articulated in 1823, declared the Western Hemisphere off limits to European colonization and intervention. For nearly 2 centuries, this has been a cornerstone of American foreign policy. The idea that Latin America is America's neighborhood and outside powers should stay out. During the Cold War, the Soviets challenged this with Cuba, and we came frighteningly close to nuclear war as a result. After the Cold War, with American unipolarity, the Monroe Doctrine wasn't really contested. Who could challenge it? But now China is making massive investments across Latin America in infrastructure, mining, agriculture, and energy. Russia is providing political and military support to Venezuela. Iran has technical cooperation with Caracas. The Monroe Doctrine is being challenged in ways we haven't seen in decades. And some analysts, I think correctly, interpret the tanker interdictions not primarily as Venezuela sanctions enforcement, but as a signal to Beijing. The United States still considers this hemisphere off limits to Chinese influence, and Washington will use its military and economic power to enforce that position. If this interpretation is correct, then Venezuela is almost incidental. The real target is China. The real message is you cannot expand your influence into our sphere. You cannot secure access to energy resources in our hemisphere without facing consequences. Beijing's response has been notably firm. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has spoken of opposition to unilateral bullying and support for national sovereignty. The Commerce Ministry has explicitly defended Venezuela's right to trade and called the interdictions a disruption to international energy markets. This is significant language. China is not just complaining diplomatically. It's signaling that it views this as a strategic issue, not merely a commercial inconvenience. Now, the question is, what can China actually do about it? China does not have the naval power projection capability in the Caribbean that the United States has. Chinese warships cannot realistically escort tankers from Venezuela to China. The geography simply doesn't favor Chinese military intervention in the Western Hemisphere. But China has other tools: economic retaliation against American companies, diplomatic coalition building against what it frames as American unilateralism, accelerated development of alternative payment systems that bypass the dollar, support for Venezuela through loans, investments, and purchases that keep the Maduro government afloat. The strategic question is whether China is willing to escalate to turn this from a diplomatic dispute into a genuine confrontation. And Beijing's language suggests that yes, China views this as important enough to push back hard. Here's what's fascinating and potentially dangerous. Even as tensions escalate over Venezuela, the United States and China are cooperating on other issues. The Commerce Ministry spokesperson mentioned reaching a basic framework understanding on TikTok through cooperation. At the same time, China is rejecting U.S. chip tariffs and criticizing American trade practices. This compartmentalization of the relationship, cooperating on some issues while confronting on others, is both an opportunity and a risk. The opportunity is that conflicts in one domain don't automatically spill over into others. The United States and China can negotiate on technology while competing over energy access. The risk is that this compartmentalization might break down if tensions over Venezuela escalate. Do TikTok negotiations collapse? If there's a confrontation at sea, do trade talks fail? And if the relationship deteriorates across multiple domains simultaneously, where does that lead? Unlike the Cold War, when the US and Soviet Union were adversaries on virtually everything, the US China relationship is more complex. There's deep economic interdependence alongside strategic competition. This makes the relationship harder to manage, but also potentially less prone to total rupture. The question is, for how long can you maintain this kind of selective engagement? At what point does confrontation in one critical area like energy access in the Western Hemisphere overwhelm cooperation in other areas? China's Commerce Ministry warned that intercepting oil tankers could disrupt the normal operation of international energy markets and trigger other security risks. This is not hyperbole, it's a realistic assessment of how interconnected global energy markets are. Every time there's uncertainty about major shipping routes or supply flows, energy markets react. Insurance premiums for tankers increase, shipping companies reconsider routes, traders build in risk premiums, prices rise. If the United States is willing to seize tankers in international waters carrying oil from Venezuela to China, what about tankers from Iran, from Russia? What about tankers passing through the South China Sea in disputed waters? The precedent being set here extends far beyond Venezuela. It affects how every country thinks about energy security, about maritime commerce, about the stability of international trade. For China specifically, this raises a fundamental question about vulnerability. If the United States can intercept Chinese energy imports in the Caribbean, can it do the same in the Strait of Malacca, through which most Chinese oil imports pass? Can it do it in the Persian Gulf? Can it do it anywhere that American naval power reaches? This is why China is pushing back so hard. It's not just about Venezuelan oil, it's about whether China's economic growth can be strangled by American control of maritime choke points and trade routes. So let me address directly the question posed in the title. Is China the real target? I think the answer is clearly yes, at least in part. Yes, the United States wants to pressure the Maduro government. Yes, Washington sees Venezuela as illegitimate and wants regime change. But if this were only about Venezuela, the seizures of China-bound tankers could have been avoided or handled differently. The fact that the United States is intercepting vessels carrying oil to China at a time when US-China competition is intensifying across multiple domains suggests a broader strategic purpose. The United States is sending a message: we still dominate the Western Hemisphere. Chinese economic expansion into our sphere of influence will face obstacles. We have the power and the will to disrupt your energy supplies if we choose to. This is classic great power competition. It's about demonstrating resolve, establishing precedents, and showing that American power still matters in regions where it has historically been dominant. From a realist perspective, this makes perfect sense. The United States is trying to maintain its position as the dominant global power. China is trying to expand its influence and secure its interests globally. Venezuela is caught in the middle, but it's really a proxy battlefield for this larger competition. This brings us to a fundamental question about international order. Are spheres of influence legitimate? The United States clearly believes it has a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere and that Chinese intrusion into that sphere is illegitimate. Washington is willing to use military and economic power to enforce this boundary. But at the same time, the United States rejects Russian spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. Washington insists that countries like Ukraine have the right to choose their own alliances, that Russian attempts to control its near abroad are violations of sovereignty. From a pure power politics perspective, this is inconsistent. Either great powers have spheres of influence, in which case both American and Russian spheres should be recognized, or they don't. In which case, neither American claims to the Western Hemisphere nor Russian claims to Eastern Europe are legitimate. China is exploiting this inconsistency. Beijing argues that if sovereign countries have the right to choose their own partnerships and trading relationships, then Venezuela has that right. And Chinese trade with Venezuela is perfectly legitimate. The United States argues that its sphere of influence in the Americas is different, that it's based on geographic proximity and historical ties, that it's about maintaining regional stability rather than domination. But these distinctions are difficult to maintain. In practice, to Beijing, to Moscow, to many countries watching this confrontation, It looks like the United States insisting on rules for others that it won't follow itself. Let me return to the Belawan standoff because it reveals something crucial about the limits of American power. The United States has the world's most powerful military. American naval dominance is unquestioned, but enforcing a blockade requires specific capabilities. Coast Guard boarding teams, specialized training, sufficient personnel deployed in the right locations, and it turns out the United States doesn't have enough of these resources readily available. The Coast Guard is stretched thin. Elite boarding teams are limited. When a tanker refuses to comply, there can be a days-long wait for the right personnel to arrive. This is what I call the gap between strategic ambition and tactical capacity. The United States can articulate grand strategies, pressure campaigns, blockades, comprehensive sanctions enforcement, but translating those strategies into action requires resources, personnel, and operational capabilities that may not exist in sufficient quantity. This matters because adversaries pay attention. If China sees that the Bella One can resist for days, what conclusion does Beijing draw that perhaps American enforcement is less comprehensive than American rhetoric suggests? That perhaps there are ways to work around American pressure, that perhaps the costs of defiance are manageable. And if that perception spreads, if other countries conclude that American power has significant operational limits, then the entire edifice of American deterrence becomes shakier. So, where does this go from here? Several scenarios are possible, each with different levels of risk. Scenario 1, limited confrontation. The United States continues seizing tankers when it can. China continues purchasing Venezuelan oil and complaining diplomatically. Both sides manage the confrontation to keep it below the threshold of serious crisis. This is uncomfortable but sustainable. Scenario 2, Chinese escalation. China decides this is important enough to take more aggressive action. This could mean providing naval escorts for tankers, which would risk direct U.S.-China military confrontation. It could mean economic retaliation against American companies. It could mean accelerated efforts to build alternative financial systems. Any of these would significantly raise tensions. Scenario 3, American retreat. The United States decides the costs of enforcement exceed the benefits. Perhaps the Coast Guard limitations become too obvious. Perhaps the diplomatic blowback is too severe. Perhaps Trump decides Venezuela isn't worth a major fight with China. Washington quietly scales back the interdictions while claiming success. Scenario 4, accidental escalation. Something goes wrong. A boarding operation results in casualties. A tanker fights back. A miscommunication leads to shots fired. Accidents have a way of transforming limited confrontations into major crisis. Which scenario is most likely? I honestly don't know. But the structural conditions for escalation are present. Both sides have staked out positions that are hard to retreat from. Both sides have domestic audiences that reward toughness, and both sides are operating in close proximity in contested waters where mistakes can happen. We also need to consider how this connects to other aspects of US-China competition, particularly technology and semiconductors. China rejected the US chip tariff plan, arguing that unilateral tariffs violate WTO rules and disrupt global supply chains. This is part of a broader American effort to limit Chinese access to advanced semiconductors and the technology to produce them. The connection to the tanker seizures might not be immediately obvious, but it's there. The United States is using its dominant position in technology, in finance, and maritime power to constrain Chinese growth and Chinese options. From Beijing's perspective, this is all part of a coordinated American strategy to prevent China from becoming a true peer competitor. Sanctions on Venezuela cut Chinese energy access. Semiconductor restrictions limit Chinese technological advancement. Financial sanctions threaten Chinese companies. It's comprehensive containment. Whether this is actually coordinated policy or just the accumulated effect of multiple different initiatives is debatable. But from China's perspective, the pattern is clear. The United States is using every tool available to limit Chinese power, and China is responding by trying to develop alternatives. Alternative energy suppliers, alternative technologies, alternative payment systems, alternative international institutions. This is the dynamic of great power competition. Neither side can afford to back down completely because backing down signals weakness and invites more pressure. What about Europe? One thing notably absent from this particular confrontation is significant European involvement. Europe has generally stayed quiet on the Venezuela issue, which is interesting. During the Cold War, European allies were deeply involved in American confrontations with the Soviet Union, but in this case, European countries seem content to let Washington and Beijing fight it out. This might reflect several factors. European dependence on Chinese trade makes confrontation costly. European skepticism about American unilateralism, especially regarding sanctions. European focus on their own immediate concerns, particularly energy security after the Ukraine war. But European absence also means the United States is somewhat isolated in this confrontation. Russia backs Venezuela, China backs Venezuela. Much of Latin America is uncomfortable with U.S. military action in the region. Washington doesn't have the kind of coalition support that usually strengthens its hand. This isolation is itself a sign of declining American dominance. During the unipolar moment, American leadership was generally followed. Now, even allies are selective about which American initiatives they support. Let me zoom out to the long-term implications, because this confrontation is really about the shape of the international system for decades to come. We're in a transition from American unipolarity to some form of multipolarity. The exact configuration is still uncertain. Will it be bipolar US-China competition, multipolar with several great powers, something else? But what's clear is that the transition is happening, and transitions are always the most dangerous periods in international politics. The rising power wants to change the rules. The declining power, or more accurately, the relatively declining power, wants to maintain them. Both sides probe for weaknesses. Both sides test resolve. The Caribbean confrontation is one front in this larger transition. The United States is trying to demonstrate that it can still dominate its own hemisphere, that Chinese expansion has limits, that American power still matters. China is trying to demonstrate that it cannot be excluded from any region, that its economic interests will be protected, that American dominance is no longer comprehensive. One of these positions will prove more accurate than the other. Either the United States will successfully limit Chinese influence in the Western Hemisphere, or China will establish that it can operate there despite American opposition. My prediction, the United States will find it increasingly difficult to maintain exclusive dominance in Latin America, not because American power is collapsing, but because Chinese economic power creates opportunities for Latin American countries to diversify their relationships. And once that happens, trying to reimpose exclusive dominance becomes prohibitively expensive. But the United States won't accept this gracefully. We're likely to see repeated confrontations like this one, as Washington tries to maintain a sphere of influence that is gradually eroding. Let me come back to the Coast Guard limitations, because I think this is more significant than it might initially appear. The United States spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. America has unmatched military technology, global reach, and power projection capability. And yet, when it comes to actually boarding and seizing tankers in the Caribbean, in America's own backyard, there aren't enough specialized teams readily available. This tells us something important about the nature of military power. Having overwhelming force doesn't necessarily translate into the ability to execute specific missions effectively. You need the right kind of forces in the right places with the right training. It also tells us something about strategic overextension. The U.S. military is tasked with maintaining presence in Europe, in the Middle East, in the Pacific, in Africa. It's conducting operations against terrorism, against drug trafficking, against sanctions violations. It's deterring Russia, deterring China, deterring Iran, deterring North Korea. At some point, even the world's most powerful military starts to get stretched thin, and adversaries notice these limitations and adapt their strategies accordingly. If China concludes that the United States cannot effectively enforce its announced blockade, Beijing might become bolder in supporting not just Venezuela, but other countries facing American pressure. The perception of American limitations can be as consequential as the limitations themselves. Here's what keeps me up at night about this situation. It's fundamentally unstable, and neither side has a clear path to a stable resolution. The United States cannot accept Chinese dominance or even significant influence in the Western Hemisphere. This is a core American security interest encoded in strategic doctrine for 2 centuries. China cannot accept that its access to energy and resources can be arbitrarily cut off by American naval power. This is a core Chinese security interest essential to continued economic growth and political stability. These two positions are mutually incompatible. They cannot both be true. One side or both must adjust. But adjusting means accepting a loss of position, a diminution of power, a setback to core interests. And states, especially great powers, are very reluctant to do this. So instead, we get escalation. Each side takes actions to demonstrate resolve, to signal that it won't back down, to impose costs on the other.